The problem with billionaires, Claire Whitmore said softly, is that nobody tells them when they're becoming pathetic. The laughter inside the private Manhattan steakhouse died instantly. Damien Holloway slowly lifted his eyes from the glowing red stock numbers flickering above the bar. His gaze settled on the waitress beside his table. Just moments ago, the room glowed with amber light, expensive laughter, and clinking crystal glasses. Investors joked about another market crash. Damien had barely looked at Claire while swirling bourbon in his glass. "All right, sweetheart," he said casually, "give me one piece of financial advice." The men around him smirked instantly. One loosened his tie. Another leaned back, waiting for the waitress to laugh awkwardly and disappear. But Claire didn't move. She simply adjusted the tray against her hip and glanced once at the numbers flashing across the screen. Then she looked directly at Damien. Calm. Steady. Completely unafraid. "You keep buying companies you don't understand," she said quietly, "because deep down you're terrified of becoming irrelevant." Silence spread across the table. One investor nearly choked on his drink while another stared at Damien expecting him to throw her out immediately. But Damien said nothing. Because for the first time in years someone had spoken to him without trying to impress him. Claire set the wine bottle gently onto the table. "Men like you think money solves fear," she continued softly, "but sometimes it just hides it better." Damien felt something strange tighten in his chest. Not anger. Recognition. Claire gave a small polite nod. "Would anyone like dessert menus?" Nobody answered. She disappeared through the kitchen doors, leaving the table in stunned silence. "Jesus Christ," one investor muttered under his breath. Another forced a laugh. "That girl has a death wish." But Damien still stared toward the kitchen entrance, distracted in a way he hadn't felt in years. Across the restaurant, Claire pushed through the swinging doors into the heat and noise of the kitchen hallway. Plates crashed into sinks and orders were shouted over the sound of sizzling grills. Steam clouded the narrow room. Yet somehow the silence from that table still followed her. "Claire," another waitress whispered urgently, grabbing her arm. "Do you even know who that is?" Claire frowned slightly while reaching for another tray. "Some rich guy with a bad personality?" The waitress looked horrified. "That's Damien Holloway. Holloway Ridge Capital." Claire glanced over briefly. "The hedge fund guy? You know him?" Claire shrugged faintly. "I studied economics, remember? Hard not to. Then maybe do not psychologically destroy him in the middle of dinner service." Claire grabbed another tray. "Then maybe he should stop asking waitresses for financial advice." She moved toward the coffee station with exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders. Her shift had started at noon and it was now almost midnight. After work she still needed to stop at a 24-hour pharmacy in Queens before going home to check on her father. The thought alone made her tired. Near the register sat her old brown notebook with edges worn from years of use. Between shifts Claire filled it with market observations and budgeting ideas and thoughts she never shared with anyone. She opened it absent-mindedly while waiting for the espresso machine to finish steaming milk. Across the top of one page, written in faded blue ink, were the words, "Money without purpose becomes addiction." Interesting sentence. Claire froze at the sound of the deep voice behind her. Slowly, she turned. Damien Holloway stood near the kitchen entrance, his tailored charcoal suit painfully out of place against the noise and heat of the restaurant kitchen. In the softer light he looked different somehow. Less untouchable. More tired. "You forgot your card, sir," Claire said calmly. Damien slipped the black card into his pocket without looking away from her notebook. "Tell me something honestly," he said quietly. "Do you always talk to customers like that?" Claire studied him for a moment. Not the expensive watch on his wrist nor the billionaire standing in front of her. Just the exhaustion behind his eyes. Then she closed the notebook gently. "Only the lonely ones." Manhattan glittered outside his penthouse windows. Gold lights danced across the dark river below. But the city felt hollow tonight. Damien loosened his tie and poured another bourbon. Even that tasted empty now. His mind kept replaying the same voice over and over again. Happy people do not need to remind the world they have won. Most people saw power when they looked at Damien Holloway. Money. Influence. Control. Claire Whitmore saw straight through him. And that unsettled him more than the market crash earlier that day. Across town in Queens, Claire quietly unlocked the door to her small apartment just after 1 in the morning. The smell of old coffee and medicine lingered faintly in the air. She slipped off her shoes near the door and immediately checked the recliner by the window. Her father was asleep beneath a faded gray blanket while the television still glowed softly with muted late-night news. Claire smiled faintly before lowering the volume. A small orange pill bottle rested beside him on the table. Almost empty. Her smile faded. She walked toward the kitchen counter and emptied her tips from the night beside a stack of unpaid bills. $37 in cash. Not enough. Again. Claire reached for her worn notebook and opened it beneath the dim kitchen light. Numbers calmed her. People rarely did. Quietly, she flipped through pages filled with stock patterns, handwritten notes, and careful budgeting ideas. Most people assumed waitresses stopped dreaming after long enough. Claire never had. She just stopped talking about those dreams out loud. The next evening, Hollow Creek Steakhouse buzzed with its usual wealthy dinner crowd. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath amber lighting while piano music drifted softly through the packed dining room. Claire balanced a tray against her shoulder while weaving carefully between tables. Table 12 needs another bottle, a manager barked behind her. Claire. She turned slightly at the sound of her name and froze for half a second. Damien Holloway sat alone near the back corner of the restaurant. No investors tonight. No laughter. No audience. Just him in a dark navy coat watching her calmly from across the room. Claire approached carefully with professional composure. Good evening, she said evenly, are you waiting for someone? No. Damien closed the menu without looking at it. Actually, I came for financial advice. Claire sighed softly under her breath. You billionaires really do not know when to stop joking. A faint smile touched Damien's face for the first time. I am not joking tonight. Claire studied him cautiously. He looked different outside the performance of wealth. More exhausted. Less polished somehow. What can I get you? She asked. Coffee, he answered, black. She raised an eyebrow. At 8:30 at night? I have not been sleeping much. Claire wrote the order down quietly. That usually happens when someone spends too much time building a life they do not actually enjoy living. Damien let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. You always talk like this. Only when people ask questions they already know the answers to. For the first time in years, Damien felt something unfamiliar during a conversation. Curiosity. Real curiosity. Claire returned a few minutes later and placed the coffee carefully in front of him. Damien noticed the small notebook tucked beside her apron. The same one from last night. What is in the notebook? He asked. Claire hesitated briefly before answering. Thoughts. About finance. About people pretending finance is not emotional. Damien leaned back slightly interested now. That sounds expensive. Claire folded her arms softly. A lot of billionaires are just lonely men trying to impress people who stopped loving them years ago. Damien stared at her in silence. The strange part was not that she challenged him. It was that every word sounded painfully true. Around them, the restaurant buzzed with wealthy laughter and soft music. But Damien Holloway barely heard any of it. For the first time in years, someone mattered more than the market. After that, Damien Holloway kept returning to Hollow Creek Steakhouse. 3 nights a week. He never stayed long. Soon enough, he disappeared back into the glowing towers downtown and the endless noise of billion-dollar deals. At first, Claire dismissed it as routine. Men like Damien Holloway worshipped routine almost as much as control. But by the fourth night, she knew better. Same booth. Same time. Same untouched black coffee. And every single night, his eyes searched for her first. "Your lonely billionaire is back," another waitress whispered while polishing glasses behind the counter. Claire rolled her eyes lightly. "He is not my billionaire. Tell that to the way he watches the door every time you disappear into the kitchen." Claire ignored the comment, though part of her knew it was true. Damien watched everything when she was around. The way she balanced 3 plates effortlessly on one arm. The way she calmed frustrated customers without sounding fake. The way she always carried that worn notebook like it mattered more than her phone. Most women in Damien's world wore diamonds and practiced smiles. Claire Whitmore carried exhaustion and honesty like they weighed the same amount. "You are staring again," Claire said one evening as she refilled his coffee. Damien did not even deny it. "You interest me." Claire gave him a dry look. "That sounds dangerous." "Probably." She leaned lightly against the edge of the booth. "So what exactly does a billionaire do all day when he is not terrifying the stock market?" Damien studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "Mostly meetings. Acquisitions. Interviews. Lawyers. People asking me for things." Claire nodded once. "Sounds miserable." Damien let out a quiet laugh before he could stop himself. The sound surprised both of them. "You really hate rich people, do not you?" Claire shook her head softly. "No. I hate people who stop seeing human beings once money enters the room." Her words settled softly between them. The restaurant buzzed with wealthy conversations, soft jazz, and amber light. But somehow, their corner booth felt like a world apart. Damien glanced at the worn notebook beside her apron again. "Do you ever let anyone read that thing?" Claire immediately slid the notebook farther against her side. "No, why not?" "Because people hear a waitress talking about finance and immediately think it is cute instead of intelligent." Damien leaned back slowly. "Maybe you are underestimating yourself." Claire looked at him carefully then. "No," she said softly, "I think the world does that enough already." For a moment, Damien said nothing. Earlier that morning, 12 executives had nodded obediently at every word he said. Not because he was always right, but because he was Damien Holloway. Claire was different. She saw the man before the money. And that made her impossible to ignore. Later that night, Claire stepped outside into the cold spring rain. Manhattan glowed around her. Taxi lights blurred across the wet streets while distant sirens hummed through the city. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and closed her eyes for a moment. "You disappear when you are overwhelmed." Claire opened her eyes immediately. Damien stood a few feet away beneath the restaurant awning with hands inside the pockets of his dark coat. "You follow waitresses outside often?" she asked. "Only the brutally honest ones." Claire shook her head faintly, though a small smile almost appeared. "Almost." Damien glanced toward the rain-covered streets. "You know," he said quietly, "most people spend their entire lives trying to get close to someone like me." Claire looked at him carefully beneath the soft city lights. "That sounds lonely too." Damien swallowed hard at how quickly she always found the truth underneath his words. Claire stared out at the rain again. "Can I tell you something?" she asked softly. "Most wealthy men think success means becoming impossible to ignore." She looked back at him then. "But the happiest people I have ever met were the ones who made others feel safe instead of small." Damien Holloway had survived market crashes, scandals, and brutal boardroom wars. But her words hit harder than all of them, because somewhere deep inside, he knew the truth. He had spent his entire life building an empire, and maybe the wrong life along with it. Over the next 2 weeks, Damian Holloway kept returning to Hollow Creek Steakhouse for reasons he no longer fully understood. At first he told himself he was curious. Then he claimed he enjoyed the conversations. But somewhere beneath the excuses Damian knew the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Claire Whitmore made him feel seen in a way money never had. One rainy Thursday night the restaurant was unusually quiet. Soft jazz drifted through the nearly empty dining room while rain slid down the tall windows overlooking Manhattan. Claire placed a cup of black coffee in front of Damian before he even ordered it. "You memorized my order," he said. Claire shrugged lightly. "You memorized my schedule first." Damian smiled faintly into the steam rising from the cup. "Fair point." She started to walk away but Damian nodded toward the seat across from him. "Sit down for 1 minute." Claire raised an eyebrow immediately. "I am working." "Your manager already approved your break." Claire stared at him suspiciously. "Did you seriously ask my manager for permission to talk to me?" "I own 3 companies, Claire. I am very experienced at negotiating." Claire laughed quietly and slid into the booth across from him. Damian studied her for a moment. The shadows beneath her eyes. The tired way she rubbed her wrist. The exhaustion she tried so hard to hide after another double shift. For the first time, she looked fragile. "Long day?" he asked softly. Claire looked down at the coffee cup between her hands. "My father forgot who I was for almost 10 minutes this morning." Damian's expression changed instantly. "Claire," she shook her head gently before he could say more. "The doctors say it happens sometimes now. Good days and bad days." Her voice stayed calm but Damian could hear the exhaustion hidden beneath it. "I used to think intelligence could solve everything," she admitted quietly. "Money problems. Business problems. Life problems." She gave a faint smile without humor. "Turns out there are some things in this world you cannot negotiate with." Damian stared at her for a long moment. He had spent his entire life believing control was the answer to fear. More money. More influence. More power. But Claire spoke about life like someone who had already learned the lesson he spent decades avoiding. "Why did you stop working in finance?" he asked carefully. Claire hesitated. "I had an internship lined up on Wall Street after college." Damian looked genuinely surprised. "You went to college for finance?" "Economics," she corrected. Softly. "I was good at it too." "Then why leave?" Claire looked toward the rain outside the windows. "My father got sick during my senior year. The medical bills started piling up. Someone had to stay." Damian suddenly imagined her weaving through crowded dining rooms, balancing heavy trays while investors barely listened to her ideas, simply because she wore an apron instead of a tailored suit. The thought unsettled him far more than it should have. Claire noticed him staring again. "What?" Damian leaned back slowly. "You should have been sitting across from people like me in boardrooms." Claire smiled sadly. "No. People like you usually do not like hearing uncomfortable truths." Damian let out a quiet breath. That might be changing. Before Claire could answer her phone buzzed sharply against the table. She glanced at the screen and her face immediately drained of color. Damian straightened slightly. "What happened?" Claire stood so quickly the booth shifted behind her. "My father wandered out of the apartment." Panic slipped into her voice for the first time since he had met her. "My neighbor cannot find him." Damian was already reaching for his coat before she finished speaking. "Come on," he said firmly. Claire blinked in surprise. "What? You are not taking the subway alone at midnight while panicking." Rain hammered against the windows. Damian Holloway stood quietly beside her, car keys already in his hand. And for the first time since Claire met him, the billionaire disappeared. What remained was simply a man worried about her. Rain blurred the streets of Manhattan as Damian Holloway drove toward Queens through the storm. Beside him, Claire kept calling her neighbor with trembling fingers. No answer. And little by little, the calm composure she wore so carefully began to fall apart. Still nothing? Damian asked quietly. Claire shook her head. She said he walked out about 20 minutes ago. Her voice trembled slightly. Sometimes he remembers where he is. Sometimes he thinks he is still living 20 years ago. Damian gripped the steering wheel tighter. Billion-dollar disasters had never frightened him. But seeing fear in Claire Whitmore's eyes somehow felt unbearable. We will find him, he said firmly. Claire stared out at the rain-covered streets. You cannot promise that. Damian glanced at her briefly. No. But I can promise you are not handling this alone tonight. The words hung quietly between them. Claire looked down for a moment, almost uncomfortable with the sincerity in his voice. 20 minutes later, Damian parked outside Claire's aging apartment building in Queens. Rain soaked the tired Queens neighborhood. Flickering streetlights glowed over old brick buildings and corner stores closing for the night. It was a world away from Damian's penthouse above Central Park. But somehow, these worn streets felt more real than the polished world he had spent his entire life inside. Claire hurried out into the rain before Damian could even open his umbrella. Mr. Whitmore, she called desperately while searching the sidewalk. Dad! Damian followed immediately beside her with his expensive coat soaking through within seconds. Together they searched block after block beneath cold rain and yellow streetlights. Claire checked every bus stop and every small grocery store and every bench along the sidewalk. Her breathing grew sharper with every passing minute. This is my fault, she whispered finally. Damian stopped walking. Claire. She shook her head quickly. I should have been home earlier tonight. You were working. I should still be there. Damian stepped closer, lowering his voice carefully. You cannot carry every bad thing in the world on your shoulders. Claire laughed weakly through the panic. That sounds like something a billionaire would say. No, Damian answered softly, it sounds like something a man wishes somebody told him years ago. Before Claire could respond, an older cashier stepped outside a small 24-hour pharmacy nearby. Excuse me, the woman called out, are you looking for an older man in a brown jacket? Claire rushed toward her immediately. Yes. The cashier pointed down the block. He came in about 15 minutes ago asking where the subway station was. He seemed confused. Flickering streetlights glowed over old brick buildings and corner stores closing for the night. It was a world away from Damian's penthouse above Central Park. But somehow, these worn streets felt more real than the polished world he had spent his entire life inside. Claire's father looked tired and disoriented, clutching an old grocery bag tightly against his chest. Dad! Claire's voice cracked softly as she rushed toward him. Mr. Whitmore looked up slowly, confused for half a second before recognition finally reached his eyes. Claire Bear, he asked quietly. Tears filled Claire's eyes immediately at the childhood nickname. Yeah, she whispered, kneeling beside him, it is me. Damian stood several feet away beneath the rain, watching silently while Claire wrapped her arms carefully around her father. For a moment the city noise faded completely. No billion-dollar meetings. No investors. No headlines. Just a tired daughter trying to hold her small world together. Mr. Whitmore looked past Claire, then toward Damian. Friend of yours? He asked gently. Claire wiped quickly at her eyes before answering. Something like that. Damian met her eyes beneath the rain-soaked lights of the city. And somehow, being needed by Claire Whitmore felt more meaningful than every billionaire title he had spent his life chasing. The rain finally slowed by the time Damian drove Claire and her father back to the apartment building in Queens. Mr. Whitmore had fallen asleep in the back seat during the ride home, exhausted from the cold and confusion. Claire carefully helped him upstairs while Damien carried the old grocery bag and the pharmacy package she had dropped earlier in the panic. The apartment felt even smaller now with 3 people inside. Warm yellow light spilled from a single lamp near the couch while the old radiator clicked softly against the wall. Claire helped her father settle carefully into bed before quietly closing the bedroom door behind her. For a moment she simply leaned against the hallway wall, exhausted beyond words. Damien stood nearby holding his wet coat in one hand. "You do this every day?" he asked softly. Claire opened her eyes slowly. "Most days are easier than tonight." Damien looked around the apartment again. The faded furniture. The stack of medical paperwork on the kitchen counter. The worn economics textbooks beside Claire's notebook. Nothing about Claire Whitmore's world looked easy. Yet somehow, she carried herself with a quiet grace Damien rarely saw among the wealthy elites who filled his penthouses and private clubs. Claire noticed him staring at the unpaid bills scattered near the sink and immediately moved to gather them together. "Do not," Damien said quietly. She paused. "Do not what?" "Hide your life from me." Claire let out a tired breath. People usually get uncomfortable when they see this part. Damien shook his head slowly. "No. People like me just spend too much time pretending struggle does not exist." Claire looked at him for a long moment. Damien Holloway stood in her tiny kitchen, soaked from the rain in a $1,000 coat. Yet the most surprising thing wasn't the billionaire standing there. It was how carefully he tried not to make her feel small. "You know," she said softly while making tea, "when I was younger I used to think rich people had everything figured out." Damien leaned lightly against the counter. "Trust me. Most of us are just professionally distracted." Claire smiled faintly while handing him a chipped ceramic mug. "That might be the most honest thing you have said so far." Damien wrapped his hands around the warm mug and glanced toward the notebook resting near the sink. "Can I ask you something?" Claire nodded slightly. "Why did you keep studying finance after leaving school?" Claire looked down at the notebook for a moment before answering. "Because understanding money is not the same thing as worshipping it." Damien stayed quiet, listening carefully. Claire sat slowly at the small kitchen table. "My father used to tell me money should make people feel safer, not smaller." Her eyes drifted toward the bedroom door. "Then he got sick and suddenly everything became numbers. Hospital bills. Insurance forms. Rent. Prescriptions." She swallowed softly. "I think I kept studying because I wanted to believe there had to be a better system somewhere." Damien stared at Claire in silence. For years, he had built empires inside glass towers and crowded boardrooms. But somehow, this tiny kitchen felt more real than the entire world he had spent his life chasing. Then suddenly the television mounted above the refrigerator switched from late-night sitcom reruns to breaking financial news. Bright red headlines flashed across the screen. "Breaking tonight. Billionaire investor Damien Holloway arrives tomorrow morning for the $12 billion Kessler Acquisition Summit." Claire's eyes lifted toward the television. Suddenly, the screen filled with Damien Holloway surrounded by flashing cameras, security teams, and reporters outside a Manhattan hotel. The billionaire world she had tried to ignore was staring directly back at her. "Many analysts are calling Holloway the smartest successor to the original Wolf of Wall Street era," the anchor continued. "Markets are expected to shift dramatically after tomorrow's acquisition meeting." Claire slowly turned her head toward the man standing only a few feet away in her kitchen. The same man who drank black coffee alone in her restaurant booth. The same man who searched rainy streets with her looking for her father. But in that moment, Damien no longer felt like a wealthy customer from Hollow Creek Steakhouse. He looked like someone powerful enough to move entire industries with a single phone call. As if on cue, Damien's phone buzzed sharply against the counter. A Forbes notification lit up the screen. "Holloway closes in on $12 billion deal." Claire stared at the headline for a long second before finally looking back at him. "I knew you were rich," she said quietly. I just did not realize the entire financial world revolved around you. Silence settled between them. Beneath the soft kitchen light, Damien looked at Claire and understood something terrifying. The honesty growing between them was no longer simple. And neither of them knew what would happen next. Claire looked at Damien Holloway like she was seeing him for the first time. Now, every moment between them felt different. The quiet confidence. The expensive watch. The guarded answers. All the missing pieces she had ignored since the night he first walked into Hollow Creek Steakhouse. Claire folded her arms tightly. Do you understand how impossible this feels for someone like me? Damien stayed silent. You walk into rooms and markets move, she continued softly. People like me lose apartments over decisions made by people like you. Her voice trembled slightly now. And somehow you kept sitting across from me drinking coffee like none of that mattered. Damien did not deny it. Yes. Claire let out a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it. And you just conveniently forgot to mention that. Damien stepped closer carefully. I did not lie to you. No, Claire replied sharply. You just let me talk to you like you were some exhausted businessman drinking coffee after work. I am an exhausted businessman drinking coffee after work. Claire shook her head immediately. Do not do that. Her voice tightened with frustration. Do not turn this into some charming billionaire joke. Damien fell silent. Claire pulled her arms tightly around herself, as if bracing against the humiliation. Do you have any idea how humiliating this feels? Claire, I stood there talking about unpaid bills while you are finalizing $12 billion deals. Damien looked at her steadily. And none of that changed anything I felt sitting here tonight. Claire looked away before he could see the emotion flicker briefly across her face. That was the dangerous part. She believed him. You should leave, she said quietly. Damien did not move. Claire. Please, Claire whispered. I'm too tired to wonder if this was real, or if I was just another distraction in a billionaire's lonely life. The sentence hit Damien harder than she realized. Because deep down part of him understood exactly why she felt that way. Men like him were used to entering ordinary lives temporarily. Billionaires always arrived with solutions. Donations. Promises. Temporary change. Then they returned to their glass towers and black cars, while everyone else stayed behind living with the consequences. But Claire Whitmore had stopped feeling temporary to him a long time ago. Damien glanced toward the notebook resting on the kitchen table. You once told me wealthy men make people feel small. Claire stayed silent. I never wanted you to feel that way with me. Claire finally looked back at him, exhaustion visible in her eyes. That is easy for you to say, Damien. You still get to walk back into your world tomorrow morning. The pain in Claire's voice settled heavily between them. Damien reached slowly for his coat. For years, he had lived in a world where money fixed everything. Hospital bills. Rent. Bad decisions. Entire companies. But none of it mattered here. Because for the first time in a very long time, Damien Holloway faced something his billions could not buy back. Trust. He moved toward the front door quietly before stopping. For what it is worth, he said softly, these past few weeks have felt more honest than most of my life. Claire looked down at the kitchen table, unable to answer. Damien nodded once to himself, then opened the apartment door and disappeared into the hallway. The moment the door shut behind him, the apartment suddenly felt painfully quiet. Claire stood frozen in place for several seconds before finally sinking into the chair beside her notebook. Her eyes drifted toward the window where rain still slid slowly down the glass. She wanted to be angry. She should have been angry. But underneath the confusion and embarrassment was something far worse. She missed him already. Across the street below, Damien stepped into the back seat of the waiting black car. His driver glanced at him through the mirror carefully. Home, sir. Damien looked up toward Claire's apartment window glowing softly against the rainy night. For the first time in years the penthouse waiting for him did not feel like home at all. Damien Holloway cancelled the $12 billion acquisition the next morning. The decision sent shockwaves through Wall Street before noon. Financial reporters flooded television networks with speculation while shareholders demanded emergency explanations. Inside the glass boardroom of Holloway Ridge Capital executives stared at Damien in stunned silence. "You are walking away from a guaranteed expansion opportunity," one board member argued sharply. "The numbers make no sense anymore," Damien replied calmly. Another executive frowned in confusion. "Since when? Do you ignore profit margins?" Damien looked toward the Manhattan skyline beyond the massive windows. "Since I realized none of us can explain how this deal actually improves people's lives." Silence settled across the room. For years Damien had built his reputation as one of the coldest financial minds in New York. Ruthless. Efficient. Untouchable. But this version of him felt unfamiliar even to himself. Later that afternoon, Claire stood behind the counter at Hollow Creek Steakhouse trying to focus on work. But above the bar, every television screen flashed with non-stop coverage of Damien Holloway and the shocking decision shaking Wall Street. Billionaire investor Damien Holloway stunned markets today after abruptly withdrawing from the Kessler acquisition deal, the reporter announced. Sources close to Holloway claim internal disagreements may have influenced the decision. Claire tried to ignore it while organizing silverware, but every sentence pulled her attention back toward the screen. Some analysts are calling it the first major strategic mistake of his career. Claire swallowed softly. Part of her immediately wondered if she had somehow caused this. "Your billionaire is officially losing his mind," another waitress whispered beside her. Claire forced herself to look away from the television. "He is not my billionaire." Yet the words no longer sounded convincing even to her. That evening Claire finished her shift and stepped outside into the cool spring air. Manhattan buzzed around her beneath glowing streetlights and streams of yellow taxis. She had barely walked half a block before noticing the black car parked quietly across the street. Damien stepped out before the driver could open the door for him. No suit tonight. No tie. Just a dark coat and exhaustion written clearly across his face. Claire stopped walking immediately. "What are you doing here?" Damien looked at her quietly beneath the Manhattan lights. "I could not stop thinking about something you said that night." Claire folded her arms lightly. "I say a lot of things." Damien shook his head slowly. "No. This one stayed." His voice softened. "Money should make people feel safer, not smaller." Claire froze slightly. Damien glanced toward the city around them. "That sentence forced me to look at my entire life differently." Damien stepped closer carefully. "You changed something in me, Claire." She looked away immediately, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. "Damien, no," he interrupted softly, "please let me finish." The city noise faded around them for a moment. "For years I thought success meant winning every room I walked into." His voice lowered quietly. "Then I met someone who made me realize I built an empire without learning how to make people feel valued inside it." Claire felt her chest tighten painfully. Damien looked at her like nothing else around them mattered. "I cannot undo who I am," he admitted, "but I can choose who I become next." Claire stared at him beneath the glow of Manhattan lights, torn between caution and the dangerous warmth growing inside her again. Then Damien reached into his coat pocket one final time and handed her a folded document. Claire frowned slightly before opening it. Her eyes widened immediately. Across the top of the page were the words, "Holloway Foundation Financial Recovery Initiative. Founding Strategy Consultant, Claire Whitmore." 3 months later, the forgotten community center in Queens felt alive again. Fresh paint covered the old brick walls. Warm lights glowed through the windows late into the evening. The cheap folding tables had disappeared, replaced by classrooms, counseling offices, and computers where struggling families learned how to rebuild their lives with dignity. Above the entrance hung a simple silver sign, Holloway Foundation Financial Recovery Initiative. Claire Whitmore stood near the front desk adjusting a stack of folders while volunteers moved around preparing for the center's official opening night. She still wore simple clothes and still carried the same worn notebook, but something about her had changed. Confidence no longer hid quietly behind exhaustion. It stood beside her openly now. "You built something incredible here," a volunteer told her softly. Claire slowly glanced around the room. Single mothers sat beside financial advisors with cautious hope in their eyes. Elderly couples quietly learned debt management together. Young workers opened savings accounts for the first time in their lives. For the first time in years, the room didn't feel filled with desperation. It felt filled with possibility. "No," Claire answered gently, "people just needed someone to stop talking down to them." Across the street black cars slowly pulled up beside the curb as reporters gathered outside the building entrance. Damien Holloway stepped out wearing a dark gray suit, but tonight there was no cold arrogance surrounding him anymore. No performance. No billionaire distance. Even the reporters seemed surprised by how calm he looked. "Mr. Holloway," one journalist called out quickly. "Is it true this program was inspired by a waitress?" Damien paused beneath the flashing cameras. For a moment he looked through the crowd toward the glowing community center windows across the street. Then a faint smile appeared on his face. "No," he answered honestly, "it was inspired by the smartest woman I have ever met." Inside the center, Claire heard the reporters erupt outside before one of the volunteers hurried toward her. "He is here." Claire's heart immediately betrayed her with one hard beat against her chest. She turned toward the entrance just as Damien walked inside. The room grew noticeably quieter. Not because of his wealth, but because people sensed something genuine between them before either person even spoke. Damien's eyes found Claire instantly across the crowded room the same way they always had. Slowly he walked toward her beneath the warm lights while conversations faded softly around them. Claire crossed her arms lightly, trying not to smile too quickly. "You are late," she said. Damien nodded seriously. "I spent 38 years being late to the important things." Claire looked down briefly, unable to hide the small laugh that escaped her. Damien reached into his coat pocket carefully and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Claire frowned slightly as he handed it to her. She unfolded it slowly and froze. It was one of the first pages from her old notebook, now framed behind glass. The faded blue handwriting remained exactly the same. "Money should make people feel safer, not smaller." Claire looked up at him speechless. Damien's voice softened. "That sentence changed my life." The room around them blurred quietly for a moment beneath warm lights and distant city noise. Damien stepped closer. "You once asked me what kind of man I was becoming." Claire held the framed page tightly against her chest. Damien looked directly into her eyes. "I think I finally became someone my younger self would have respected." Claire felt tears sting her eyes before she could stop them. Damien smiled gently. "And for the record," he added softly, "this is the first thing I have ever built that actually feels valuable." Claire shook her head faintly with emotional laughter escaping through the tears. "You really do not know how to flirt like a normal person." Damien stepped even closer then with a voice quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Claire Whitmore," he said softly, "can I finally ask you out without turning it into a financial discussion?" Claire stared at Damien for one long moment. Then slowly, she smiled. The first genuine smile he had seen from her since the night she learned the truth. Beneath the warm lights of the community center, she reached for his hand. Outside, Manhattan rushed endlessly through another night of money, ambition, and noise. But inside that small building in Queens, two lonely people finally discovered something no billionaire could ever buy. A place to belong.